clean part from Seasons in the Abyss by Slayer. I'll include a tab in the links in the description as always. I'll also mention this is played, it was recorded in a different tune, it's in E flat, so if you don't know what that is, I'll describe that in another video. I'll put a link to that as well. But for practice you can just play it in your standard tuning, makes no difference, but if you want to play to the song you're going to have to tune to E flat. So that being said, it's quite a simple riff. I would say it's mainly all about your picking technique rather than your fretting technique. And I'm going to cover both separately because I think it's the best way to try and approach learning it. So I'll start with your fretting hand first. So what have we got? If you look at the tab, I suggest you do, you can break it down into 4 little simple chord shapes. We're only using 2 fingers per chord, which is why it's simple, but we need to make sure that we get the technique right and the fingering right, otherwise we might end up tripping ourselves up. So technique wise, we want clean chord technique, we want the notes trying to ring out rather than being muted or fluffed. In terms of the fingering, the reason I mention that is I quite often come across when people are reading tab for the first time, particularly beginners, if they're not used to, I've mentioned before on this series, but it's worthwhile when you're trying to learn something from tab, not just taking it note by note, reading ahead a little bit so you can see what's coming, so you know what you might have to do in advance. That might help advise the fingers that you're going to use to play it with. So with that being said, a lot of times if you're just starting out, because your strongest fingers are your first finger, your second finger, people tend to go for those as your go-to fingers when you're making a chord, even a little simple 2-note chord like that. I'm going to suggest using your middle fingers, so your literally your middle finger and your ring finger, to start off making these chords out. So if you look at the tab, we've got the first chord we're going to look at is going to be 2nd fret on your D string and 3rd fret on your G string, and then 2 open strings. So that's one of the 4 chords that we're going to use to play this piece. I've done it using that fingering for a reason. That'll become apparent on the 4th of the 4 chords, because I need this finger to be able to do that, even though we're only using 2 fingers. So what I would suggest is, if this type of riff, the speed that's played at, isn't that comfortable for you, just practicing this first chord to begin with, playing across your 2nd fret on your D, 3rd fret on your G, and then we've just got your open B and open E. Before we get into any of the fancy picking that I'll come to later. Now, once we've got this chord in mind, in our head, the trick to the fretting hand part of this is, the only thing that changes is the first note of the chord each time. The other 3 notes stay the same. So by the first note, I mean that 2nd fret note. The other 3 notes stay the same, which makes it quite easy for us to be able to play it. Now the last 2 notes, the open strings, the B and the E, we don't have to do anything with those, they're simple. The second note's worth mentioning, the one that I'm playing there on my 3rd fret on my G string. Throughout this entire riff I want to keep that note anchored on, so I want to keep that 3rd finger on that note all the time without moving it off, and that's just going to make it so much easier for us to be able to do it. So whilst I'm playing my first chord out, obviously I've got those 2 fingers on, but when I come to play my 2nd chord, I want to keep that 3rd finger on that G string and not take it off. So on my 2nd chord, when I come to play it, I'm playing, rather than starting on my 2nd fret on my D string, I'm playing my 3rd fret on my D string. So my middle finger is just going to shift up 1 fret, and I'm going to keep my 3rd finger, my ring finger, on the G string, and the open strings will sort themselves out. So I'm going from to. Again, there's a bit more picking to it than that, but just to start with, we'll just get these chords sorted out so that we can concentrate on one thing at once. So the first chord, we're starting 2nd fret on the D string, 3rd fret on the G string and 2 open strings. That plays through twice, and then the 2nd chord, I'm moving my 2nd fret on my D up to the 3rd fret on my D, and that plays through once. So I'll just play those bits without the other picking bits so you can see what it will sound like. And then we come to the final 2 chords. This is where it's important that we use the correct fingering. So for the final 2 chords, again, I'm keeping my 3rd finger, my ring finger, exactly where it is, anchored on that G string on the 3rd fret. And what I'm going to do, my starting note's going to change. It's going to be my 3rd fret on my A string, that note, and the other 3 notes, the final 3 notes of the pattern, are going to be the same. That's for the 3rd chord in the sequence. And for the 4th chord in the sequence, I'm just going to play my 2nd fret on my A string, which is where my 1st finger comes into it. So I'm playing as my starting note. I'm going to be careful with our picking there. I'll talk about picking in a minute, because we're skipping a string there. We're having to pick a string, skip a string, and then play the other 3. I'll talk about that in a moment. So the actual, just concentrate on the fretting bit. The last 3 notes of each pattern are going to be the same, and we're just moving around the starting note. So we're moving around our starting note from perhaps you just practice that if you want to, just to get used to moving around that starting note, and then you can add in the 2nd note, your G string note that we're going to use our ring finger for. And then build it in and add the open strings in. So with a little bit of thinking ahead and planning what we're going to do, we can keep that fretting hand technique really simple. I would imagine probably the challenge for you, if this is a challenge for you, is keeping that note anchored on your G string, that 3rd fret. That's super important. So have a go at practicing those little bits that I've just done. I broke it down into sort of manageable chunks before we get onto the picking, because that's what really brings the riff alive. So have a go at that, pause if you need to, come back to it, and then once you've got that fretting hand sorted out, let's concentrate on the picking hand. So in terms of the picking, there's a number of different ways you can approach it. There's 3 off the top of my head that I can think of in terms of how we're going to pick the notes out. Before we come to that, again, study your tab and look at the pattern of the notes as we're going up and down the notes that are played in the chord. So for the bits that I was doing for practice on the chords, I was just going down and leaving it at that. So just take that first chord, for example, the starting one. Rather than just going down, we're going to go down and then back up. pattern, and you're going to use that for the second chord as well. So it's the same pattern for the first and the second chords. Now in terms of the picking technique in our picking hand, as I said, there's a few ways that we can approach it. I don't know if you noticed what I was doing whilst I was picking, if you could make it out on the camera. I was using what I'd probably call a technique that's in between sort of just down picks and alternate picking, called economy picking. Now, I don't normally recommend that type of picking for beginner players if you're not already familiar with the other picking techniques. You can play it with either, so just to show you, you can play it all with downstrokes if you want to, and if you're used to picking down, that might be your easiest way to get started off on playing the riff, because you'll be familiar with that. So it's perfectly fine. You can play all those notes with downstrokes. The pace of the riff it's slow enough for you to be able to do it with a bit of practice. So just start with that first chord. If I just use downstrokes, if you look at my picking hand, you can see that every note I'm picking down. That's probably the most straightforward, easiest way to pick it. The second way, again, it's quite a simple way if you can do the technique, is alternate picking. So we're going to pick down, up, down, up, down, up, down, up. Personally, I don't think that technique really works very well for this riff in terms of the feeling of the riff, but it can be done. So if you are used to alternate picking, if you're comfortable with that, you can alternate pick the notes. So you're going to be strictly, every note's going to be down, up, down, up, down, up. Fluff the last one there, but that's one of the reasons why it's not the greatest technique to use for this particular riff. So of the two, out of those two, I'd probably suggest down picking. The method I used, I was using a combination of picking techniques. So my picking pattern that I used for the first chord pattern, I was picking down across the first 4 notes, and then for the next 2 notes I picked up, and then the last 2 notes I picked down. So if I think of that first chord as being 8 notes to play that first chord, my first 4 notes down, notes 5 and 6 up, 7 and 8 down. So 1, 2, 3, 4 were down, 5, 6 was up, 7, 8 was down. The reason I've chosen to use that myself is because it emphasises the downpick notes, which to me sounds closer to the feel of the original song. I can use that same pattern on the second chord as well, the one that we move up our finger to the 3rd fret. Even though we're going to do it once, I can use that same picking pattern. And on the last 2 chords, we've only got 4 notes per chord, and I just downpicked on all of the 4 notes. So when I moved across to my A string, I just downpicked those. That's when we need to be wary of the string skip, because I'm playing a note on my A string, I'm missing my D string entirely, and then I'm playing the 3rd fret on my G, open B, open E, and same when I move down to 2nd fret. That's the string skipping part. So a little bit to think about with the picking. Sorry if that's confusing. If it is, probably just pick it all down until you get used to playing it. You might find it tricky to pick down at the speed of the song if your picking technique is still in development, but as ever, you don't need to pick it at full speed. We can start off slowly and we can build it up. I was playing it at, play it slowly, no problem whatsoever. Make sure you just get the notes clean before we worry about getting up to speed. If you just play it as an exercise, you don't ever even have to get it up to speed, because you're not going to play along to the record. And don't forget, if you are playing along to the record or trying to, you need to tune down, which I've covered in another video in the links. Just one final thing, the chords that I'm using here, they might not be familiar to you if you're just familiar with your normal basic starting out chord vocabulary, your normal majors and minors and chords like that. And they do sound a little bit iffy. They don't sometimes quite sound right. Now, that's not because Slayer can't play chords. It's not because they're rubbish guitar players. They're very good guitar players. It's because of the feel of the song. It quite often happens in that type of heavy metal, thrash metal, that the chords sound a little bit, not I wouldn't say out of tune, but a little bit edgy. And the reason for that is they're trying to make the music sound suspenseful, as though it's a little bit, it's not quite right, and it's waiting to resolve to something. And it does in the song. It resolves to some fifth power chords, which sound quite normal compared to what was played in those arpeggio riffs. So don't worry if they don't sound. It almost sounds like you might be playing a wrong note somewhere, but it's designed that way, so don't worry too much about that. So it's a good practice riff, because you've got a lot of stuff there technique wise that you can have a go at. Even if you don't like Slayer, you don't have to play the super heavy thrash metal headbanging stuff, because it's good for your picking techniques, really good for your picking technique, and also good for getting that technique of anchoring a finger and moving the other ones around to create the riff. So have a go at it, and in doing so, hope you enjoy.